Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled Canada in a Changing Climate Synthesis Report. My name is Suzanne Sealing with the Climate Risk Institute. I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Climate Risk Institute is in Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory on the traditional lands of the Atikamek and Anishinaabeg, as well as Wahnapitae First Nation. And CRI staff live and work in many places across Turtle Island that are the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. Together, we're continually trying to improve our knowledge, processes, and relationships so that we can highlight and embody Indigenous perspectives and knowledge of climate change. We welcome you today. For the webinar, I will be available if you run into audio or technical issues. To ask me a question, you can open the chat box. Using the drop-down arrow, locate my name, Suzanne Sealing, and send me a private message. Please note that your microphones have been disabled to avoid any audio distraction or feedback during the webinar. There is a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. Please feel free to type out your questions during the presentation into the Q&A box. Questions can be posed in an official language of your choice. We have enabled simultaneous translation for the webinar. To listen in French, click the globe icon for language interpretation and select Listen in French. We are recording the webinar today and will be sending out a link to everyone who is registered along with a copy of the presentation slides. Now I will introduce today's speakers. Fiona Warren is a lead editor on the National Issues Report and the Regional Perspectives Report, and a lead author of the Synthesis Report. She is the Knowledge Assessment Manager leading the National Knowledge Assessment process at the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division at Natural Resources Canada. Kristen Walsh leads outreach and engagement for the National Knowledge Assessment process at the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division. She was also a lead author of the Synthesis Report. Elizabeth Bush is a senior climate science advisor at Environment and Climate Change Canada and was a lead editor of Canada's Changing Climate Report, the first report released in the Canada in a Changing Climate National Assessment Series. And last but not least, we have Peter Barry, the senior policy analyst and science advisor at Health Canada. He was lead editor of the Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action report, released as part of the Canada in a Changing Climate National Assessment Series in 2022. Without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Fiona.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Suzanne. Okay, so I am very excited to be here today because it marks a very exciting point in the assessment process where we are officially marking the end of the long journey of our current process, where we worked with many different partners, some of whom are with us today, such as Peter and Elizabeth and others on the line. And also excited to be sharing the results of the synthesis report finally, which we released in December. In terms of our goals, it's to really share the highlights, as I mentioned. Oh, I said them. Officially wrap up our current process. The outline for today, I'm going to start by providing a bit of an overview of the national assessment process, so some context on what our assessments are, what the goals are, and how we complete them, and also provide some highlights of what we did differently in this process. We'll then move on to the synthesis report. I will provide just an overview, fairly high-level overview of the key messages, as well as the key conclusions of the report. Then I'll pass it over to my friends and colleagues, Peter, Elizabeth, and Kristen, to provide some additional highlights and reflections. We then have about 10 minutes set aside for you all to provide your input through a Mentimeter session. And then we'll use the time we have left for some Q's and A's. So as Suzanne mentioned, don't hesitate to post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So overall, a very packed agenda, but we hope you all find it interesting and engaging. Next slide, please. So I always start my presentations with this slide just to make sure that everyone understands what we mean when we say a science assessment or a knowledge assessment, because I mean, there are different definitions and understandings out there. So for us, this refers to credible, useful, and decision relevant products, generally reports, but they could be other products as well, that synthesize the existing knowledge base. So they're not an opportunity for new research. They're really gathering together all the information that's there on climate change risks, opportunities, and adaptation. In terms of the goals, they're quite similar in our process to those of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that is to raise awareness of the key issues with respect to climate change, impacts, adaptation, and climate science in the case of the Changing Climate Report. Um, But more importantly, they really aim to provide a foundation for decision making. This is why they need to be credible, they need to be useful and decision relevant. They do not, however, they inform decision making, but they are not policy prescriptive. So they don't provide instructions of what to do or how to do it, more to provide inspiration and ideas. And finally, we hope to build capacity on adaptation through the assessment process itself. As you'll see in the following slides, we work with hundreds, if not thousands, of people through these processes. And just we have a little side note at the bottom there that we have been leading the assessment process on climate change impacts and adaptation since the mid 2000s in our group at NRCan. And next slide, please. So we launched the current process way back in 2017. It turned out to be a little longer than we had originally planned due to some delays, which we really couldn't control, such as COVID. But we do think it was a very successful project, and that success depended in a huge part on all the wonderful people we had the opportunity to work with. So we really do not do these reports alone. We work with other departments and organizations in terms of leading reports. We work with people from all across the country as coordinating lead authors and lead authors. We had an incredible 20-member advisory committee that helped guide the process this time, providing ideas and input. That was made up primarily of assessment users as well as subject matter experts. There were also over 280 contributing authors and over 300 expert reviewers. So a low estimate of the number of people involved in this process is about 650. In terms of the process itself, this figure here illustrates the main steps. So we start by launching the process. That involves a lot of engagement. So we have already launched our next process. So we've started on the engagement for that, but I'll stick to the one we're at right now. We go through the planning process. We build the author teams. So we engage coordinating lead authors who then invite other authors to make sure we have the necessary expertise and capacity. And then these authors go and they really assess the knowledge base out there. Quite an extensive process. The review period is incredibly important to the national assessment, to all the reports, because this is what helps ensure that the reports are credible, that the information is relevant, and that it speaks to the audiences that we're trying to reach. The reports then go through quite a long finalization process, and then they are released on our website. Okay, that's all. Next slide, please. So as I said, we launched this process back in 2017, and it was quite an ambitious cycle for us. So the name for this process was Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action. There were a total of 6 reports released under this process. The most exciting element, I think, for us is that all of these reports are available on the same website. So you can access them all at changingclimate.ca. So the first report to be released under this process was Canada's Changing Climate Report. That looked at how and why Canada's climate is changing, and that came out in 2019, quite a few years ago now. In the middle phase, we had the National Issues Report that looked at impacts and adaptation issues that were important across the country, or sort of best to analyze through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective: water resources, communities, ecosystem services, and a suite of others. We had the Regional Perspectives Report. 6 regional chapters were included in that, as well as Health of Canadians and a Changing Climate Report that Peter will speak to a bit later. And then in the final phase, We were incredibly excited and honored to release the For Our Future Indigenous Resilience Report, and that just came out in May this year. And this is really the first of its kind in Canada, an assessment, an Indigenous-led assessment that discusses climate change impacts, experiences, and perspectives from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And then finally, we had the report that we're going to talk about today, which is the synthesis report. This actually came out in December, but we are finally getting to the webinar today. And what this report does is it draws from the other 5 reports in the process. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we tried a number of new elements in this process. We're still at the stage where we're sort of analyzing our results, but we do feel like we've made good progress in all of these respects. First, we put a much stronger focus on enhancing engagement and communications, and that was before in terms of scoping, during surveys, workshops, conferences, and after release. Second, as I mentioned, we had a suite of products where in the past we might have done 1 report, maybe 2. We had the 6 reports in this series, as well as a number of complementary products, supplementary reports, a Trello board of amplification materials, videos, things like that. We also structured the reports, all of them a little bit differently this time, where we used the key messages approach, where the information was really provided in layers. So there was a high level key message that people could browse through just to pick up the key ideas, supported by a plain language paragraph to provide more detail on the key message. And then that was supported by the in-depth assessment and analysis supported by the literature and the knowledge base. And one significant aspect of this is it meant that the reports were maybe a little bit less comprehensive in the past, but they were more focused on the needs and priorities of the target audiences. We also had a much greater focus on the inclusion of multiple sources of knowledge. So going beyond the peer-reviewed literature base to look at local knowledge, practitioner knowledge, and most importantly, Indigenous knowledge systems. For the for the first time, we also explicitly asked the authors to identify knowledge gaps and emerging issues. Kristen will speak to those a little bit later, but that really helped us, will help us going forward in terms of research priorities, funding priorities, and establishing a baseline. And finally, as I mentioned, all the reports were designed for digital delivery, all available at the same site, which allowed us to do things like have interactive figures, videos embedded throughout the different reports and chapters, searchability and linkability. And this really did make a huge difference for us in terms of the reach of our reports, orders of magnitude higher, and we're pretty excited that our number of page views is now over 1 million, which is quite high for a government process. Next slide, please. So since we are now officially closing a process, a very long process, I want to just take the opportunity to formally thank everyone for all the contributions they made to the report and the process over the last 7 or so years. This includes our colleagues from other departments and organizations that led reports, all the reviewers that volunteered their time, all their authors, and an especially special shout out to our coordinating lead authors of the National Issues and Regional Perspectives reports, as well as the advisory members who really formed our core team throughout. So we really appreciate their work, input and ideas, engagement and enthusiasm. Their input really strengthened our reports, helped our process reach its goals, and made our work at the Secretariat so rewarding. Thank you on behalf of the Secretariat. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move on to the synthesis report. So in terms of developing the synthesis, this was a report that we did in-house. I just thank the co-authors of the report, Nikki, Julia, and Kristen, with the guidance of the advisory committee and support of the coordinating authors and the leads of the other reports. So what it involved was an in-depth analysis of the other 5 reports that I presented a few slides ago to really tease out the key themes and the recurrent messages and sort of tried to focus a little bit on your messages as well. Our goal was to make it highly accessible, using plain language to the degree possible, engaging and informative, and also to encourage people to dive into the underlying reports. I'm going to go through the key takeaways and key conclusions, but just wanted to draw your attention quickly to a couple of other features of the report. Hope that you go see it after, And one is that many of the key conclusions are accompanied by a video with an interview with a practitioner where they're sharing their perspectives on adaptation in their areas of work. They're really interesting first person accounts, so I encourage you to go take a look. And there's also a lot of really useful tables throughout the report. If you're in the line of work where you need some examples, we have tables on things like adaptation at the local level, indigenous-led climate action, and examples of nature-based approaches. I'll just highlight those quickly. Next slide, please. So these three takeaway messages they are quite high level, and they were used to frame the import and encapsulate the 10 key conclusions, which I'll present in a minute. And we do recognize that they are not necessarily groundbreaking statements, but they are very important to emphasize because they are really backed by a vast amount of knowledge that was captured in the underlying reports. So I'll just go through them quickly here. The first is that climate change impacts and adaptation actions are particularly evident in certain critical sectors and ecosystems. And these sectors I'll go into on the next slide, but they include things like infrastructure, human health, and natural resources. The second is that Canada's economy is affected now and will be affected more in the future by the large and rising costs of these impacts. And these include the economic costs, of course, but also there's many non-market and intangible costs that also need to be considered. And the third is really to acknowledge that we do still have an adaptation gap in Canada, and that gap is the difference between the adaptation action in terms of the implementation that is happening now and what is needed to improve our resilience to climate change. And this is evident in the economic losses and the impacts that were referred to in the other messages as well. Next slide, please. So now I'm getting into the key conclusions of the report. And now these first three really focus on impacts. And I just do need to acknowledge that we are seeing impacts of climate change in almost every sector and absolutely every region of Canada. However, there is higher evidence or high evidence in certain sectors, and these include infrastructure, health, food production, in this case, agriculture, and natural resources. So the first one for infrastructure, a key challenge we are facing is that our infrastructure in Canada is aging, and really much of it was not designed for the climate of today, let alone the climate of tomorrow. One study that we cite in the report estimates that $5.3 billion a year will be needed over the next 50 years to reduce the risks just to the municipal infrastructure alone. The second one speaks to the impacts on our health, showing that climate change is increasing risks, causing severe and sometimes catastrophic impacts. And I won't go into detail on this one because Peter will speak to it in a little bit. And the third is that in terms of food and natural resources, these are sectors that are particularly sensitive as they do rely on favorable weather conditions and they're vulnerable to extreme events, but they're also facing increased risks from indirect impacts. For example, impacts related to trade, where there are increased challenges in getting the products to the markets. Finally, I do want to emphasize here that within these sectors, we also see some of the greatest potential for adaptation, as well as the greatest action on adaptation. And this shows to me that the risks are being recognized and in many cases prioritized. So they're good sectors to learn from in terms of adaptation as well. Next slide, please. The next three key conclusions here, 4, 5, and 6, sort of highlight the rationale or the justification or the business case for adaptation. So the first one here, key conclusion 4, the business case for adaptation is strong. This is supported by many studies that show that the benefits, including the avoided costs gained through adaptation, exceed the costs of implementation. Estimates do vary. We do have a study cited within the report that shows that for every dollar invested in adaptation, it yields about $5 to $6 in benefits. And as I mentioned before, it was really more than just an economic issue. There's many non-market costs to consider in our analysis, such as effects on health, culture, and identity. The second one here drew primarily from the Ecosystem Services chapter that's within the National Issues Report, but also from many of the regional chapters as well. And here it's referring to nature-based approaches, such as using wetlands for coastal protection, or to reduce flooding, or urban forests to reduce the heat island effect. I believe that they're growing in popularity because they are recognized as flexible and very cost-effective. They also bring a range of co-benefits, which are discussed in the report, such as carbon sequestration and recreational opportunities. We do note within this key conclusion too, though, that these approaches require healthy ecosystems. So factors such as conservation and preservation of ecosystems can also be considered an adaptation approach. Key conclusion 6 here really focuses on the state of adaptation in Canada to the degree that was possible, recognizing that this was not an implicit goal of the underlying report. But what we did find is that overall, we've made very good progress on adaptation planning, and there's much, much, much more knowledge and literature and examples to draw from to show that Canadians recognize climate change as an issue and that adaptation is important, but the progress on implementation still remains quite slow. So we looked at some different mechanisms cited throughout the reports to encourage action. This include things like incentives, tax breaks, and grants, as well as ways to reduce sort of the barriers that have been addressed, maybe addressing capacity issues, as well as improving coordination across sectors to really, as mechanisms that can help close Canada's adaptation gap. Next slide, please. So these final 4 key conclusions are sort of more forward-looking, focusing on themes emerging from the reports on things like good principles, best practices, as well as roles on adaptation. First, we found that at the local level, or local level adaptation is really playing a leading role in our climate change response. We saw that in chapters of the National Issues Report, as well as the regional chapters. And we found that in terms of planning, municipalities and communities have made great progress, and there are many excellent case studies highlighted throughout the report. However, as I mentioned for the previous slide, moving from that planning stage to the implementation stage is still proving challenging. The second key conclusion here, key conclusion 8, draws primarily from the For Our Future Indigenous Resilience Report. It discusses how First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are being disproportionately impacted by climate change and are facing growing risks. And it emphasizes the importance of self-determined and Indigenous-led adaptation, as well as a need for a better understanding of Indigenous rights-based approaches in taking climate action and how together these can help support reconciliation. The third one here, key conclusion 9, we pulled from the reports as a sort of an emerging issue, a theme that was woven throughout the different chapters and reports. The key conclusion discusses how adaptation must address ongoing inequities and strive to benefit those most in need. It concludes that with proper planning and decision, collaboration, and work, greater equity can be a strong co-benefit of many adaptation actions. And finally, it was clear that the private sector could play a much stronger role in adaptation going forward. Businesses face a range of direct and indirect costs, and better engaging and empowering the business community and other private sector stakeholders will help finance the adaptation gap and address market and behavioral barriers, which are quite important to adaptation. So the private sector is recognized as a key component of the whole of society approach to adaptation. That concludes the key conclusion. So next slide, please, Suzanne. So now I'm going to, well, first, thank you for listening to me ramble on. I know it was a little longer, and I encourage you all to check out this report for more detail, as this was really just a quick overview. So we're going to take about 15 minutes now to discuss a few aspects in more detail. Peter Barry is going to talk about climate change risks to health and adaptation action. Then Peter will pass it over to Elizabeth Bush, who will speak to changes in Canada's climate. And finally, Kristen will wrap up this part of the presentation by talking more about the knowledge gaps and emerging issues that I mentioned. So over to you, Peter.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the webinar today. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and Kristen and Elizabeth, given the really close collaboration between Health Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. on the health assessment, the health of Canadians in a changing climate. So we know that climate change and variability are affecting health in Canada, health of individuals, but also health systems. And we also know that we can be effective in our adaptation actions and in protecting health, even as these risks increase. So the Science Assessment Report, Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate, really provides the latest scientific evidence to help health authorities prepare for climate change, but also decision makers outside the health sector, because they're really critical as well. So a key, really big finding of the report is that climate change is already impacting the health of Canadians, and health risks will increase as warming continues to increase. In fact, there's really a wide range of risks associated with climate change, and they're growing in Canada. So things like impacts on infectious diseases, impacts on food and water quality and security, risks associated with increased air pollution, natural hazards like extreme heat events, flooding, ice storms, and even impacts on mental health. And we have more information now on how serious these health impacts can be, and how quickly these risks are rising. So you'll be very familiar with the very severe heat dome that affected BC in 2021 that tragically took 619 lives and put great stress on their health systems. And one study showed that in 2017, 2,740 premature deaths and many more illnesses were attributed to particulate matter from wildfire smoke in Canada. And the estimated cost of those health impacts was over $22 billion. And rapid warming has also supported the emergence of Lyme disease in Canada, causing really a dramatic increase in human cases. So from 144 in 2009 to 2,525 in 2022, as it spreads northward into Canada. And climate hazards have been shown to also impact, as I mentioned, mental health. So these effects can include things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and even suicidal thoughts. And increased anxiety and grief, just associated with awareness of climate and climate change, can really lead to sort of climate or eco-anxiety or ecological grief as well. And importantly, we're starting to attribute some of these health impacts directly to climate change, from heat events, from wildfires, and for example, the increase in Lyme disease as well. And for the first time, this assessment was also able to evaluate the effects of climate variability and change on health systems in Canada. And so health infrastructures, operations, health financing, public health programming, supply chains, and even the health workforce can be impacted by some of these extreme events, but also chronic stresses to health systems over time from climate change. And all of these reduce the quality of care to Canadians. So, for example, heat events in Ontario in 2019, affected air conditioning in health facilities, resulting in canceled surgeries, patient transfers as well. In that same year, Hurricane Dorian caused power outages in hospitals in Nova Scotia, along with water damage, canceled appointments, and temporary closures that affected health. And these impacts are affecting health systems across Canada, and they'll grow in the absence of strong adaptation measures. Now, the health assessment also examined the unique challenges by Indigenous peoples in Canada. And the health impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples are really far-reaching. So they relate to, impacts on food and water quality and security, air quality, infrastructures, personal safety, mental health and well-being, livelihoods, culture, and even identities. So, for example, rapid thawing of permafrost affects the stability of buildings, health clinics even, and roads in communities in northern Canada, which also affects, transportation and access to services. In addition, as it melts, permafrost can also release metals, heavy metals, such as mercury, that can affect health. However, First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples have been actively observing and adapting to changing environments in a diversity of ways since time immemorial. And preparing for the health impacts of climate change requires that Indigenous peoples' rights and responsibilities over their lands, natural resources, and ways of life are respected, protected, and advanced. Now, so evidence from the assessment shows that we currently have a health adaptation gap. Fiona mentioned, the adaptation gap. Well, the health sector has one as well. There's much that needs to be done to prepare for these impacts. But it also shows that we can be really effective in protecting individuals, in protecting communities and health systems moving forward. And so efforts to get ahead of the climate change curve can benefit the health of Canadians include the following types of examples: education and training of health professionals, monitoring and surveillance of climate change impacts and of the effectiveness of adaptation measures, increasing our knowledge about climate change impacts through conducting climate change and health assessments from the local to national scales, but also communicating risks and protective measures to the public and to stakeholders is really, really important. And integrating considerations and information about high-risk populations, those that are disproportionately impacted, into all of our activities as we move forward. But the assessment really importantly found that adaptation is not enough. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is also required to protect health, and the health sector can take a leadership role in this regard. And reducing these greenhouse gas emissions can provide really substantial and immediate health co-benefits, for example, through improved air quality in support of more active outdoor activities. So it's really hoped that the results of this assessment can provide the knowledge that'll help the health sector decision makers from local all the way to national levels effectively prepare for climate change, including through the National Adaptation Strategy and other collaborative mechanisms. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And like you, just want to be clear to everybody that while I'm here and I'm with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Canada's Changing Climate Report was led by our department, but there was very much a collaborative effort involving experts from many government departments as well as universities across Canada. So as Fiona mentioned earlier in the webinar, Canada's Changing Climate Report was the first report in the series of reports contributing to this cycle of the national assessment. It was also the first time that a standalone climate science assessment for Canada was completed as part of the national assessment process. So very much a milestone in that regard as well. The report was released back in April 2019, so over 5 years ago now, which is why we have already started the process to release a second Canada's Changing Climate Report to be released hopefully 2025, 2026. So just wanted to mention that right off the start. Canada's Changing Climate Report provided a robust assessment of the state of knowledge on how and why Canada's climate is changing and what changes are projected for the future. It covered changes in temperature, precipitation, and related extremes for these variables, changes in snow, ice, and permafrost, changes in freshwater availability, and changes in the ocean surrounding Canada. So just to be clear, the scope of the report was assessing changes in physical climate variables. We did not assess changes in biological variables. And Canada's Changing Climate Report was therefore the physical climate science foundation for the other reports in the National Assessment Series and for this synthesis report. There's no time in the 5 minutes I was given to go through the conclusions of the CCCR, Canada's Changing Climate Report, but I wanted to emphasize that a strong body of evidence exists and was assessed in the report, documenting changes in climate in Canada, in the atmosphere, on land, and in the surrounding oceans. Canada has warmed about twice as much as the world as a whole, with even stronger warming in northern Canada. And among the many changes observed are increases in average temperature, in extreme warm temperature, decreases in extreme cold temperature, increases in annual precipitation in many parts of Canada, earlier peak stream flow, shorter snow and ice cover seasons, ocean warming, and acidification. And if you could just go back to the other slide, I wasn't ready to jump ahead yet. Thank you. Okay, we're still here. Thanks very much. And rising sea level along many coastlines of Canada. And of course, since some additional global warming is inevitable as emissions of greenhouse gases continue globally, many of the observed trends that are documented in the report are projected to continue and in some cases intensify, which is also very much a part of the report. Regional variations in both observed and projected changes are also discussed in the report and can be important considerations for adaptation decision-making. Also shown on this slide is the cover of a supplemental climate science report that was delivered in 2022. Some of the author team to Canada's Changing Climate Report collaborated to produce this report following the release in 2021 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Climate Science contribution to the 6th assessment cycle. And this supplemental report was developed to provide expert perspectives on the consistency of findings in Canada's Changing Climate Report with those from the IPCC science report, anticipating that was the kind of question that would be generated or would occur to Canadian audiences, and they would appreciate an authoritative perspective from the authors of CCCR on those findings. And not surprisingly, the supplemental report found strong consistency in results. Now, please, the next slide. So for the synthesis report, the authors of Canada's Changing Climate Report were asked to provide a short summary of results. And in thinking about how to do this, we decided to create a new table for the synthesis report that highlighted the assessment of observed changes, their attribution to human influence, and future changes for just a select group of key climate indicators, as indicated here on the slide. So these were selected just to spark interest and as representative of key changes in different components of the climate system. So really, this table was meant to be illustrative rather than comprehensive in terms of summarizing results from Canada's Changing Climate Report. But we hope that it is a useful highlights table, and it also serves as an entry point into the more comprehensive Canada's Changing Climate Report. And there are lines of sight to the source material provided in this highlights table. We also drew again from results in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report to include in this table and the final column here on the screen to show assessed changes in the same indicators at the global scale. Again, this serves to confirm the consistency of changes in climate at the continental and global scale. To note, the Canada's Changing Climate Report adopted the calibrated uncertainty language that is used by the IPCC to convey levels of confidence and likelihood in findings. But confidence levels are determined from a qualitative assessment of the evidence base, while likelihood levels are quantitative estimates of uncertainty in a finding. And in this table, the different levels of confidence and likelihood in results are shown in different colors. Really what I wanted to just mention here is that one of the real benefits of using this language and applying it consistently is it allows scientists and those reading results to understand how confidence or likelihood in changes for a particular climate indicator strengthens or changes as the evidence base changes and grows. And we plan to use this language again in the second Canada's Changing Climate Report that is underway now, due to be delivered, as I said, in 2025 or 2026. So I think the consistent application of this language, it is our hope that this will allow audiences to easily track how the evidence base is growing. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Kristen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So I'll just really quickly do like a shallow dive into the knowledge gaps and emerging issues. As Fiona mentioned, in the previous assessment, it was the first time that we included these in NRCan-led reports. And it was quite a synthesizing exercise to whittle them down to a 3-page annex. I've only highlighted the key themes on this slide, and would encourage you to cycle back to Annex 3 of the report for concrete and nuanced examples. But I thought I could speak to a couple of them today. So for instance, when thinking about the intersection of health and adaptation, a much broader understanding of compounding mental health concerns, including ecological grief and solastalgia associated with climate change, is paramount. When thinking about, for example, Indigenous-led action and adaptation, additional research is needed on the intersections between climate change and Indigenous laws and languages, in addition to decolonizing climate change research, assessments, and actions to advance Indigenous-led climate governance and policy. Specific to water resources and adaptation, increased knowledge of how climate change is affecting groundwater drinking supplies is sorely needed. From an equity lens, further research is needed on how climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable and marginalized groups, while at the same time looking into how we can uplift and learn from the inherent adaptive capacity. We heard the need for more research to better understand economic consequences of extreme events and catastrophes, as Fiona mentioned, and on a international implications level, thinking about climate change related displacement and migration and its implications for Canada is really important. Next slide, please, Suzanne. So some of these emerging issues and knowledge gaps have been reflected in scoping exercises that have been underway for our team at Natural Resources Canada over the past year now. And so this one is some responses that we've seen, and it's a good segue into what Suzanne is going to lead you through now with the Mentimeter exercise. So with that, Suzanne, I'll pass the baton back to you and we can switch to the next slide. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Kristen. Okay, so now we are going to switch gears a little. We really would love to hear from you. So to access the Mentimeter, please enter www.menti.com in your mobile device or in a new window in your computer browser. And there's a code, so it'll prompt you to access the code 88252496. There's also a QR code on the screen if you prefer to access it that way. I'll give everyone a few minutes just to get connected to that. So it's menti.com, code 88252496. And now I'm going to switch my screen over. Just bear with me for a second. Okay. So it looks like people are still joining. It's great. We'll give you a few more minutes there. The first question is, where are you joining from today? Pretty interesting. It's a great visual. Great. Couple more minutes, seconds, so. Very, very diverse. Okay, great. We'll move on to the next question now. What topics within the synthesis report key messages most resonated for you? So we have health, equity, infrastructure, adaptation, A lot of really great responses there. Okay, excellent. Move on to the next question. Addressing knowledge gaps requires additional work at the intersection of adaptation and you'll enter what you think comes next. So far, ecosystems and nature-based approaches are coming in at the top, followed by indigenous-led adaptation. Okay, super. Give it 10 more seconds to get your answer in. Excellent. All right, moving on. What climate indicators or climate-related hazards are of most interest to you to have assessed in the next Canada's Changing Climate Report? Great, looks like drought, wildfire, flooding are some of the most common climate indicators or hazards that are of interest. Okay, let's do 10 more seconds. All right, excellent. The next question, what health co-benefits and risks are important for you to consider when developing and or implementing adaptation actions? So far, mental health is top. Physical health, equity. Excellent. I'll do 10-second countdown. Great. Next question, which of the following best describes Canada's current stage of adaptation? The options there are recognizing the issue, preparing and planning, implementing actions, and reviewing and adjusting implementation actions. So far, preparing and planning is the highest response, followed by recognizing the issue. Super, let's do 10 more seconds. Great. Thanks everyone for your participation. That was some excellent responses, and I'm sure it'll be very valuable to the team. So now, I'll just change the slide. Okay, so now I'll pass it, no, now, sorry, we have Kristen. Kristen, would you like to speak to this slide first before Q&A?
Sure. While you have it up, I can speak to it quickly, and then maybe we could just pop it up at the very end of the webinar. Yeah, so we just wanted to let you know that we have a survey that's being up on our website on changingclimate.ca. You can also follow the QR codes. There's a survey in English and French. We've had 1,200 respondents so far and would love to hear from you. So it's another way to really tangibly weigh in on themes and approaches for the next cycle. I won't repeat the bullets for environment and health. They gave a great overview of where they're at in their process. Really exciting to see everyone coming along. And just a shout out perhaps that NRCan, our team is doing a virtual scoping workshop next week, which will be hosted by CRI and the very competent Suzanne on June 11th. And we'll pop the link into the chat for that. But it's an open scoping workshop, so everyone is welcome to attend. And with that, yeah, I think we could jump into the Q&A. Thanks, Suzanne.
Great. Okay, thanks, Kristen. So we do have a question from Ruth. Ruth asks, do you have a sense if the private sector is motivated by the business case to adapt, or will it require regulation to ensure private sector plan for the long term? Which, as evidenced by inaction on climate mitigation, is difficult for humans to do, especially when dealing with market forces which operate in the immediate.
So I can take a stab at answering that question. Not my field of expertise, but we do have the key conclusion within the synthesis on that. And I would refer you, Ruth, too, as well, to the chapter we have of the National Issues Report on climate disclosure, litigation, and finance. So in terms of my sense, there definitely is a demand there for more detailed case studies. So really the business sector are looking for examples of where other people have really made decisions and taken action, and they can see the results. At the same time, there are some regulations in place. If you think about financial disclosure of risks, so for publicly traded companies, they have an obligation to disclose their material risks, and that's talked about a little bit more in the chapter that I mentioned. But overall, there will definitely be a role, I would say, for the government in terms of having really clear and consistent policies, legislation, and regulation as well to really help that sector move firmly into the sphere of adaptation. Because as we conclude in the synthesis, we're not seeing nearly many examples as we would expect, given the fact that it's very clear that the sector is experiencing already the impacts of climate change, both the direct and the indirect impacts. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. Do any other, Elizabeth or Peter, do you have anything to add?
No, thanks so much.
Okay.
Not me
Okay.
either.
Yeah. Right. Fiona, great job. Okay, so we have a question now from Andre. We have seen in the US, Florida, how an administration can shut down climate change action or even mention of the words climate change in spite of a lot of evidence of the impacts. A change in the federal or provincial government in Canada could derail progress in addressing mitigation and adaptation. Did report contributors consider how to deal with changes in the political environment?
So I'll take the first stab at this one too, just from, because I can speak to the National Issues Report, the Regional Perspectives Report, and the synthesis. So a very short answer is no, not really. We did not address the question within the past reports. There was a small amount of discussion in the Rural and Remote Communities chapter of the National Issues Report that looked at political influence, but we haven't, it's an interesting topic. It might be a little tricky to do within the context of a non-policy prescriptive document, but definitely something to consider. Different approaches to addressing, because it is definitely an important issue going forward. Peter, I don't know if there was anything within the health assessment that you could comment on in that respect.
No, I mean, I think very similar to you. I mean, we just focused on synthesizing the science and what we know, and providing it to the decision makers that are out there to really help them with the really urgent impacts that we're starting to see. So, yeah, thanks.
I think it just goes back to one of your first slides, Fiona, where you talked about the purpose of knowledge and science assessments to inform decision making, to provide, neutral, not policy prescriptive, robust, credible information to support decision making. And so that's where the boundary is generally drawn for science assessment reports.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, but at the same time, I mean, we are drawing from the existing knowledge base. So if there is, there's literature out there that looks at those, they're fair game for inclusion within our reports.
Something I'd add too that I've heard Fiona say a lot, or sometimes, is while these aren't policy prescriptive assessment reports, we do really hope that other forms of government or communities or organizations run with them and do create policy from them. So there is like a next step.
And maybe I can add to that. One really exciting development, certainly in the health sector, is there are many more local and provincial and territorial assessments being conducted, and that's really building the knowledge base very broadly. And so that's actually going to be a different dynamic, I think, when we do the next health assessment, that we really need to consider that and include that knowledge and that science. But I think that's a really important development to keep in mind too, that many people are doing this now, which is really exciting.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions. So we are at time. We're at top of the hour. I'll let someone on the CCID team enter perhaps an email address in the chat box where you can send any questions that we weren't able to get to if you think of anything else after the webinar. And hopefully someone can get back to you. So, okay, that's everything on our end. Fiona, Elizabeth, Kristen, Peter, thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful hour. Do you have any final remarks?
I was just typing into the chat there just to let everybody know, based on the Mentimeter results of the question related to the climate science assessment, there was lots of interest in extremes, and we do have a dedicated chapter on changes in climate extremes for the next climate science assessment report. So it's a new something we didn't do last time, so we're really excited about it, and I think that it'll be of great interest to a lot of people, and obviously feed into the impacts assessment of future reports. So wanted to just flag that to everybody.
Super, thanks for that, Elizabeth. That's great.
I'll just say a very, very quick thank you to everyone. It's been a very
short and sweet.
short and sweet. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining, and thanks to my co-panelists for presenting. It's been great working with you all.
Okay, great. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending.